Last night, I was out with some of the cats in the band.
He was born into the dust and heat of the South. Blind before he was a teenager, black in a world built to break him, poor in a country that measured worth by dollars he did not have. And yet, when Ray Charles sat at the piano, the universe bent to his will. His voice was raw gravel dipped in honey. His fingers struck keys like lightning through a storm. And his sound, it didn't just entertain. It changed everything. Ray Charles tore down the walls between gospel and blues, between the sacred and the profane, and in the wreckage he built something brand new. Soul, but Ray's story is not the clean arc of a hero. It is stained with addiction, betrayal, and the gnawing loneliness of a man who could never quite outrun his demons. He was celebrated as a genius and branded a sinner, crowned the father of soul, but hounded by the law, by prejudice, by his own hunger for more. The myth says Ray Charles was a musical prodigy who conquered blindness and rose to fame. But the truth is far more complicated, far more human, and far more powerful. This is the story of a man who redefined American music, who forced the church's holy fire into the world's smoky nightclubs, who dared to sing about heartbreak and desire with the same conviction as a preacher calling down God. The backdrop was the Jim Crow South, the civil rights struggle, and the birth of Motown and Stax. It was a time when music wasn't just melody. It was survival. And Ray Charles became its prophet. Why does this story matter? Because without Ray Charles, there is no Aretha, no Stevie, no Marvin, no hip-hop samples that still echo his grooves. He was the hinge, the crossroads, the man who made America's music speak its deepest truth. Joy and sorrow are the same song. Tonight, we're telling the story they tried to silence. Welcome to Echoes of Soul, where voices never fade, even when silenced. We uncover the untold struggles, the secret battles, and the raw truth behind the icons who gave soul its heartbeat. This is more than a channel. It's a sanctuary for those who feel every note, who know music heals and haunts. So lean in. You're among believers who remember every harmony, every heartbreak, every cry from the stage. This is Echoes of Soul. The curtain drops. The voice carries on. Before he was the genius, before the world called him Brother Ray, he was just a boy in the red clay of Georgia, where the summers were heavy with heat and the air carried both gospel hymns and the cries of a divided South. Ray Charles Robinson was born in 1930 in Albany, Georgia, to a mother who worked as a laundress and a father who drifted in and out of the picture. Poverty wasn't the season in Ray's childhood. It was the permanent backdrop. His earliest memories were not of toys or ease, but of wooden shacks, tin roofs, and the scent of soap as his mother bent over washboards, fighting to keep her family alive. And then came the darkness. Around age 5, Ray's eyes began to fail him. Glaucoma crept in, and within a few short years, the world went black. Imagine it. A child in the segregated South, blind before he could even read, locked in poverty with no protection from the storms of life. That could have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, because Ray had a mother who refused to let him drown in pity. "You're a blind boy," she told him, "but you ain't stupid." Those words became chains and wings all at once, harsh, unyielding, but the very truth that would carry him. She pushed him to do for himself, to walk the crooked paths of the South without a guide, to fight his own battles. The world may have taken his sight, but his mother made sure it would not take his spirit. And in the darkness, music became light. The Baptist church filled his ears with choirs that shook the rafters. The juke joints spilled out blues that dripped with longing. He soaked it all in, gospel on Sunday, barrel house piano on Saturday night. Already, the lines blurred in his young mind. Why should the sacred and the secular be divided? Why should a note that healed souls not also stir bodies? At the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind, Ray learned Braille scales and the classics. But more than that, he learned how to listen with everything he had. Every chord was a color, every rhythm, a shape. Blindness forced him inward, and from that inwardness came vision. But beneath the promise, there was already foreshadowing. Loneliness. Nights when the silence pressed too heavy. Days when poverty whispered he'd never escape. Ray Charles was being forged in fire. Poverty, loss, blindness. And in that crucible, the sound of soul itself was waiting to be born. Because before he was the father of soul, he was a child of struggle. And every note he would one day play still carried the echo of those chains. By the time Ray Charles stepped out of childhood and into the world, America was already telling him what lines not to cross. Lines between black and white, between church and street, between imitation and originality. But Ray was never one to obey boundaries drawn by others. When he first began performing, the young man from Greenville, Florida wasn't yet the genius. He was the imitator. On bandstands across the South and up the coast, Ray sang like Nat King Cole, smooth, urbane, velvet on velvet. He charmed audiences, no doubt, but he wasn't yet himself. In smoky clubs, in roadside roadhouses where neon signs flickered against empty glasses, Ray was learning the game. But something inside him burned restless. I could play like Nat, he later admitted, but Nat was Nat. I had to be Ray. That search for identity pushed him westward. Seattle in the late 1940s was buzzing with jazz, rhythm, and blues, a far cry from the shack where he grew up. Here he cut his first records, and here he found a family of fellow musicians who heard the raw brilliance buried inside him. But Ray knew he couldn't just mimic the crooners. He needed to carve a sound that was his own. The breakthrough came when he stopped hiding the church inside him. Those Baptist chords, those guttural moans, those sanctified rhythms he'd carried from the pews into his bones, he let them loose on secular songs. He blended gospel's thunder with the blues ache, and in doing so, broke the sacred line. He took Sunday morning and set it loose on Saturday night. Some called it blasphemy, others called it genius. Either way, it couldn't be ignored. By the early 1950s, signing with Atlantic Records, Ray began cutting sides that were unlike anything on the radio. Songs like Mess Around and I've Got a Woman shook the industry. Here was a sound that was carnal and holy, wild and disciplined. He wasn't just crossing the line. He was erasing it. But innovation never comes without a cost. The church that raised him saw a betrayal. White radio stations were hesitant to play music so drenched in black gospel energy. And in the South, where Jim Crow still ruled, Ray's rising fame put him at constant risk. Celebrated on stage, yet segregated in hotels, restaurants, and buses. Still, Ray pressed forward. Each night, as he sat at the piano with sweat pouring down, his voice tearing through smoky halls, he was birthing something new, something dangerous, something undeniable. He was no longer just a blind boy who survived. He was becoming a prophet of a sound that would one day be called soul. And yet, as the applause grew louder, so did the temptations waiting in the shadows. The stage lights were bright, but behind them, darker habits began to stir. Chapter 3. Velvet Shadows. By the mid-1950s, Ray Charles was no longer just another name on the marquee. He was the marquee. The clubs that once barely paid him now filled with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, desperate to hear that holy thunder turned into rhythm and blues. He was a storm contained in human form, hands flying over the piano, voice trembling between gravel and silk, sweat dripping as though each song was pulled straight from his soul. The world began to take notice. With Atlantic Records behind him, Ray carved out hit after hit. Drown in My Own Tears, Hallelujah, I Love Her So, and the explosive What I Say. That last one, born in a moment of improvisation during a club gig, was pure fire. a call and response straight from the pulpit, laced with moans that were anything but holy. It scandalized some, hypnotized many more, and cemented Ray as a force who could not be contained. But success is a velvet shadow. It wraps you soft, warms you with praise, and hides the teeth beneath. Behind the curtain, Ray was grappling with loneliness that no ovation could drown out. The blindness that the world saw as triumph was also an isolation that cut deep. He was adored by millions, yet locked in his own silent dark. And into that silence, heroin came whispering. Heroin was the poison of the era, spreading through jazz clubs like smoke, promising relief from pain, promising escape. For Ray, it dulled the ache of grief, the memory of watching his younger brother drown when Ray was just a boy. It dulled the pressure of being a black man walking into segregated towns, celebrated on stage, but denied a bed at the local hotel. It dulled the guilt of straddling gospel and the blues, knowing that to some he was still a blasphemer. But heroin also shackled him. Nights blurred into mornings, studios became confessionals where genius flowed 1 hour and paralysis the next. Bandmates whispered, managers worried, but the music kept coming, so the machine kept running. And yet, within the haze, his artistry only grew bolder. He began orchestrating complex arrangements, blending big band jazz with gospel grit, layering voices like a choir standing on a mountaintop. His sound wasn't just evolving, it was exploding into something America had never heard before. The contradiction was brutal. The higher he soared, the deeper the shadows clung. The man hailed as a musical savior was quietly becoming enslaved to the needle. But Ray Charles was no stranger to struggle. And in the late 50s and early 60s, as his fame surged, he faced another battle. One not just against his own demons, but against a nation still refusing to see black genius as equal. Chapter 4, A Voice Against the Silence. By the early 1960s, Ray Charles had become more than a hitmaker. He was a movement. His music wasn't confined to jukeboxes and dance halls anymore. It was breaking onto pop charts, played in homes that had never welcomed a black artist's voice before. Ray was doing what segregation tried to forbid, crossing over. And yet, outside the studio, Jim Crow still ruled. Touring through the South meant stepping off stage into humiliation, separate bathrooms, separate hotels, restaurants that refused to serve the very man whose songs filled their radios. For many black musicians, the choice was survival, swallow the insult, play the show, take the money. But Ray was cut from another cloth. In 1961, when he was scheduled to perform in Augusta, Georgia, he learned the audience would be segregated. Whites on the floor, blacks shoved into the balcony. Ray refused. He canceled the show, walking away from money, from promoters, from pressure. Georgia's officials punished him, banning him from performing in the state. But history remembers that moment as something larger. A blind man seeing clearer than those who held power. The decision wasn't just personal defiance. It was a line drawn in the cultural sand. Soul music had always carried the cry of freedom. But here was its prophet taking that cry into action. His music was already blurring boundaries, gospel into blues, black into white charts. And now his life was echoing the same truth. Equality wasn't optional. It was inevitable. Even as he made headlines for activism, Ray kept reshaping the soundscape. His 1962 album Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music was a revelation. A black soul singer reinterpreting the whitest of genres. Songs like I Can't Stop Loving You didn't just top charts. They toppled cultural barriers, showing that soul was not confined by color lines or categories. But success and courage came with new costs. Critics from the church still accused him of dragging gospel into sin. White industry insiders whispered about betrayal. A black man daring to take country music and make it his own. And back home, Ray still wrestled with heroin, with the ghost that stalked him in silence. This was the paradox. A man who gave a voice to millions but could barely quiet the wars inside himself. Yet, as the crowds grew, So did the stakes. For Ray Charles, the 60s would be a decade of triumph and trial, and the choices he made would determine not just his legacy, but the very shape of American music. Because every time Ray opened his mouth to sing, he wasn't just entertaining, he was testifying, and the next testimony would be his loudest and his most dangerous. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom. Every prophet carries a cross, and for Ray Charles, it was heroin. By the mid-1960s, the drug wasn't a passing vice. It was a chain he dragged from tour bus to studio, from city to city, even as the world hailed him as a genius. The arrests came like echoes of his hidden life. In 1961, federal agents caught him with heroin in his hotel room. Newspapers splashed it across headlines. Ray Charles arrested on narcotics charges. For many, it was a confirmation of every whispered fear, that the man who blended gospel with the blues must also be a sinner off stage. Ray pleaded guilty, served probation, and swore to himself he would fight the habit. But heroin is patient. It waits in the wings, whispering comfort when the applause fades. By 1965, the battle had reached breaking point. Another arrest, another scandal. This time, the law came harder. The FBI had him on their watch list. A black man with fame, money, and influence was already dangerous. Add drugs to the file, and Ray Charles became a target. The same government that had turned a blind eye to segregation had both eyes locked on him. But Ray refused to let the darkness write his ending. In 1965, he entered rehab, facing withdrawal like a man walking through fire. Friends said he screamed through the nights, his body racked with pain as the poison drained out. But he emerged sober, scarred but alive. And unlike so many of his peers, he stayed clean for the rest of his life. Still, the scars were deep. The arrests damaged his reputation. Some radio stations pulled his songs. Some promoters backed away. Yet, in a way, this crucible hardened him. The Ray Charles who walked out of rehab was not just a survivor. He was a man determined to own his freedom on every level. His music reflected that. In the late 60s and early 70s, Ray kept pushing boundaries, experimenting with jazz, pop, and even orchestral arrangements. Some critics bristled, calling him inconsistent, unfocused. But Ray never bowed to categories. Freedom, after all, was the price he had paid in blood, sweat, and withdrawal. The irony was sharp. A man who gave voice to freedom through his music was nearly destroyed by his own search for it through drugs. But the chains of heroin were broken. And now, new chains waited. Chains not of needles and powder, but of an industry ready to exploit even its greatest genius. Chapter 6. The Genius in the Machine. By the late 1960s and into the 70s, Ray Charles was not just a star. He was an institution. The name alone sold out arenas. The sunglasses, the swaying shoulders, the howl that could flip from agony to ecstasy in a single breath. Ray had become a symbol of American music. But symbols are dangerous things. They can be worshipped and they can be exploited. The record industry knew it. Labels circled him like hawks, eager to cash in on his genius. Atlantic had launched him, but it was Warner and later ABC Paramount that saw his value climb into millions. Yet behind the contracts and gold records was a truth Ray never forgot. Artists like him, black artists, were often used, chewed up, and discarded. Ray refused to be owned. He demanded control over his masters, a move unheard of at the time. When ABC Paramount agreed, he made history, one of the first black artists to own his recordings outright. It was revolutionary. Every note he sang, every piano lick he laid down, belonged to him. But independence came with its own price. With control came the pressure to keep delivering hits, to keep feeding the machine that wanted Ray Charles not as a man but as a product. His albums of the 70s experimented with lush orchestration, country ballads, even mainstream pop. Some fans applauded the risk. Others whispered he had lost touch with his soul roots. Ray didn't care. To him, freedom meant refusing to be boxed in. Not by race, not by genre, not by critics. He was the genius, and he would not be chained. And yet, the machine always finds a way to take its pound of flesh. Endless touring schedules wore down his body. The money brought lawsuits, financial disputes, hangers-on with open palms. Ray's personal life grew tangled. Multiple relationships, children across different families. To the public, he was a legend. In private, he was a man often alone, often weary, trying to hold on to the empire he'd fought to build. But when he sat at the piano, when his voice broke into Georgia on My Mind, the world forgot the machine. That song, his rendering of it, became the official state anthem of Georgia in 1979. The same state that had once banned him for refusing to play to segregated crowds now bowed before him. It was vindication, but it was also irony. Ray Charles had won the battle against Jim Crow, against the industry's exploitation, against blindness itself. And still, shadows trailed him. Because even the genius could not escape time, and the years ahead would test whether his crown could truly last forever. Chapter 7. A Crown of Thorns. By the 1980s, Ray Charles had lived long enough to see himself transformed into myth. Younger artists called him the genius, with reverence. His influence stamped on every soul riff, every R&B groove, every gospel-tinged cry on the radio. He had outlived many of his peers, survived heroin, broken through racial barriers, and secured a throne in American music. And yet, the crown he wore was heavy, a crown of thorns. The music industry was changing. Disco had come and gone. Hip-hop was rising from block parties in the Bronx. Synthesizers and drum machines replaced the raw bands Ray had once commanded. To a new generation, his style seemed old-fashioned, the smoky clubs of the 50s and 60s fading into memory. Legends risked becoming relics, but Ray refused to fade. He toured relentlessly, night after night, his body no longer young but his spirit unbroken. Audiences cheered, some for nostalgia, others for reverence. And always, when he struck the keys, the electricity returned. Songs like Georgia on My Mind and Hit the Road Jack were no longer just hits. They were sacred texts, etched into the American hymn book. Still, the private struggles never left him. Diabetes stalked his body, stealing his strength. The empire he built required constant attention, lawsuits, tax troubles, and the endless logistics of managing a career that never slowed. His personal life remained fractured, a web of relationships, children, and obligations that no stage light could illuminate. Yet, even in decline, Ray carried a kind of defiance. In 1986, when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted its very first class, Ray Charles was there, not as a footnote, but as a pillar. He was recognized not just for hits, but for creation itself. The man who birthed soul, who tore down walls and built a bridge between gospel and blues, black and white, sacred and secular. But even accolades cannot soften time's grip. By the 1990s and early 2000s, his health faltered. The once tireless genius now moved slower, the voice roughened, the frame more fragile. Yet, the fire never dimmed entirely. When he sang, even in his last years, there was still that ache, that joy, that unmistakable truth that no disease could erase. Ray Charles had conquered blindness, poverty, racism, addiction, and exploitation. But mortality, that final silence, was one battle even the genius could not win. And as the last curtain began to draw, the question lingered. How would the world remember him? As a man of flaws, or as the sound of America itself? Chapter 8. Legacy. Ray Charles died in June of 2004 at 73 years old. The obituaries called him the genius, the father of soul, the man who changed American music forever. But to stop there would be to reduce him to a statue, polished smooth until the cracks vanish. Ray's true legacy lies in the cracks, in the battles, the contradictions, the sacrifices that gave us a sound no one else could have borne. What did Ray Charles leave us? He left us freedom in music. Before him, gospel was confined to Sunday, blues to the barroom, country to the farmland, and pop to the airwaves. Ray smashed those walls. He taught America that a note doesn't care where it comes from, sacred or secular, black or white, church pew or jukebox. If it carried truth, it belonged. His influence is everywhere, in Aretha's Holy Fire, in Stevie Wonder's kaleidoscopic soundscapes, in Marvin Gaye's cries for justice, in every R&B singer who dares to bend pain into beauty. Hip-hop producers still dig through crates for Ray's riffs, his piano stabs, his cries, because they carry authenticity no machine can replicate. His music wasn't just sampled, it was scripture for a new generation. But Ray's legacy is also a warning. He showed us what genius costs. Blindness took his sight. Racism denied his humanity. Heroin stole his years. The industry tried to own him. And still, he fought for control. Over his masters, over his art, over his soul. He won much of that battle, but the scars remain. Every voice we celebrate comes with a price. And perhaps that is Ray Charles's greatest gift. Not just the sound he gave us, but the questions he left behind. What do we demand of our artists? What chains do we wrap around them? Of expectation, of exploitation, of myth. And how many prophets do we lose before we learn to protect them, not just praise them? Ray Charles was no saint. He was flawed, messy, human. But when he sat at the piano, he turned that humanity into something eternal. He made the world weep and shout and believe, all in the same breath. And that is why Ray Charles didn't just change music, he changed what music was allowed to be. We've walked with Ray Charles from the red clay of Georgia to the neon stages of the world. We've seen a boy lose his sight but gain a vision that would rewrite the language of American music. We've seen the triumphs, the songs that became scripture, the walls he tore down, the freedom he demanded. And we've seen the shadows, addiction, loneliness, exploitation, the heavy price of genius. But through it all, one truth remains. When Ray Charles sang, he made us feel everything. Joy and sorrow, sacred and profane, despair and redemption. He held contradictions in his hands and turned them into harmony. That is why his music will never die. Ray didn't just change the charts. He changed the very idea of what music could do, how it could heal, how it could unite, how it could testify. His sound lives on in every artist who dares to sing with both pain and praise, in every hip-hop track that samples his grooves, in every voice that refuses to be boxed in. So now we ask you, what's your Ray Charles moment? Was it the raw thunder of What I Say? The aching tenderness of Georgia on my mind? The duet of joy and heartbreak in Hit the Road Jack? Tell us your memory, your song, your echo of Ray. Because his story doesn't just live in history books, it lives in us. And if this story moved you, stay with us. Because next time, we'll step into another life. One marked by the same fire, the same prophecy of pain and beauty. If Ray Charles showed us how music could break the rules, then Marvin Gaye will show us how it can break your heart. Ray Charles left this world in 2004. But the sound he gave us, it still breathes, still aches, still testifies. Forgotten by none, broken by much, crowned with thorns. And still, the genius. The curtain falls, but the voice carries on.